week of anti-imperialist struggle. I'll put the link in the chat. We'd love you to get involved. It's a week of actions and art and webinars around anti-imperialism with social movements and political groups from around the world. So for today, we'll move swiftly. As everyone knows, we're in a crisis and we need urgent transformation. That can happen in a couple of ways. One is by working against folks like Trump and their sanctions and militarization policies in Latin America. And the other way is to build links and solidarity between the British left and the left in Latin America. So we're really excited to have all these global guests today and to discuss ways we can be building those links. We're obviously on Zoom right now, but you can also reach us on the Arise YouTube page and the Facebook page, and you can pop questions in the chat on all those platforms. So I'll introduce our speakers. First up, we have our friend Alex Main, who is in Washington, DC at the moment. He's with the US-based think tank Center for Economic and Policy Research. Then we have Ollie Vargas, who is currently in Bolivia. So his reception might be a bit dodgy, but hopefully it'll be okay. He's a Bolivian-based journalist. We have Julia Felmanas from the Brazilian Workers' Party. And also, if you caught Dilma, Jeremy Corbyn and Glenn Greenwald's chat, she was doing the interpretation, so thank you for that. We'll soon be having Lara McNeill joining us, who recently did a medical exchange with Cuba and is a Labour NEC youth rep. And finally, we will hear from Colin Bergen, who's with Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America. So I think we'll start with, we've moved our order around, but I think we're going to go back and start with Alex in DC. Everyone's going to make some opening remarks, and then we'll move it open to all your questions and do some rounds of questions. So please pop those in the chat.
Yes, hello, is that my cue? Yes, thank you, Suzie, and it's good to see you all. Colin, who I haven't seen for ages. I'm glad to see that you're all here and well. And so, yes, about Trump in Latin America. Before he took office, Trump was a bit of a wild card on Latin America, as he was on many issues. There was hope that his proclaimed opposition to the Iraq War and the US military presence in the Middle East during the 2016 campaign might have translated into a less interventionist approach to global affairs than previous US administrations, including those of George W. Bush and Obama. Alas, that hope was dashed very quickly. Trump has, of course, let foreign policy hawks, people like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, shape much of his foreign policy. And perhaps worse still, he's allowed diehard anti-Castro fanatics, in particular Florida Senator Marco Rubio, to guide much of his Latin America policy. And he's done this seemingly because, like so many national politicians before him, he considered that a hard line towards Cuba and the Latin America left would help him hold on to the state of Florida in the 2020 elections. But Trump himself, without any coaxing, has proven to be an extraordinary bully and imperialist with regard to the region. He's publicly talked about intervening militarily in Venezuela, and according to John Bolton, if John Bolton is to be believed at all, but also other sources, he's privately talked of seizing Venezuela's oil fields. And of course, he's threatened Mexico with paralyzing tariffs if the government there didn't engage in intense repression of Central American migration from Central America. So we don't have the counterfactual to a Trump administration, of course, and it is likely that the Latin American policy of a Hillary Clinton administration would have been quite awful given Hillary Clinton's record as Secretary of State when, among other things, she helped a military coup in Honduras succeed. But we can certainly say that Trump has truly lived up to Simón Bolívar's expectation of the United States being destined to plague Latin America with misery. And there really are too many horrors to list here. And I'll just focus on two Trump administration moves in the region. One, because they've been particularly devastating for the countries concerned. And two, because sadly, the UK and Europe have supported these moves. And since we're talking here about solidarity, and since I believe I'm addressing a mostly British audience, I thought it would make sense to highlight the UK and Europe's complicity in two of Trump's worst crimes in Latin America. So the two destructive sets of policies I want to highlight are Trump's violent regime change policy towards Venezuela and his successful regime change policy in Bolivia. So what has happened in each instance? In Venezuela, regime change has been on the US government's agenda since early on in Hugo Chavez's administration, nearly 20 years ago. Most of you will remember the short-lived US-backed coup against Chavez in 2002. And US policy has basically remained on the same regime change track ever since. Under Trump, though, the policy has become even more aggressive. And so guided by Senator Marco Rubio and the anti-Castro zealot Mauricio Claver Carone, Trump began imposing deadly economic sanctions against Venezuela in August of 2017, so shortly before coming into office. And then in January 2019, his administration recognized a Venezuelan opposition hardliner, Juan Guaido, as president of Venezuela, and explicitly called on the nation's armed forces to rebel against the government of Maduro. And when no military coup took place, Trump ramped up the pressure against the country with new asphyxiating sanctions on Venezuela's vital oil industry. And ultimately, there has been no political change in Venezuela, but the sanctions have caused immense economic damage and have led to tens of thousands of avoidable deaths. And our research center published a paper on this, co-authored by economist Mark Weisbrot and economist Jeffrey Sachs, that has an estimate of about 40,000 deaths caused by these sanctions. And that was as far back as early 2019. So what did the UK and most of Europe do? They supported the US regime change strategy and recognized Guaido. And instead of denouncing, or at least distancing themselves from the US attempt to stoke a military coup, they have embraced the US strategy. The Europeans and the UK also supported the financial asphyxiation of Venezuela by freezing Venezuelan government assets under their jurisdiction. And of course, the most notable case of this is the UK government actively preventing the Venezuelan government from repatriating any of its nearly $2 billion in gold reserves that are being stored at the Bank of England. So that's Venezuela. And the second particularly destructive Trump policy I wanted to highlight is the successful regime change policy targeting Bolivia. So here, the US, the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the European Union have worked in tandem. On October 21st, and I imagine Ollie will speak more about this, so I won't go into too much detail, but on October 21st, the day following Bolivia's peaceful democratic election, the OAS Electoral Observation Mission falsely claimed that there had been an unexplainable drastic change in the vote count trend, suggesting fraud. And this claim, which the OAS subsequently repeated even after they were proven wrong by a number of independent analysts, including those at my organization, CEPR, these claims fueled a narrative of electoral fraud, which was used by the opposition to stoke violent protests. Evo Morales, the elected president, was then forced out of power by the military. The US and the OAS, led by Luis Almagro, darling of the Latin America far right, embraced the coup and the far-right racist de facto government that seized power afterwards. Violent repression of protesters followed, leading to dozens of deaths, And we've also seen since then the persecution of leaders of Evo Morales' mass party in a clear attempt to keep them from returning to power in the next elections. So the EU had its own observation team in Bolivia. It could have easily pointed out the blatant inaccuracy of the OAS observation mission's claims. And if they didn't have a statistician in their team, they could have easily found one to analyze the OAS's claims. Instead, they supported the OAS conclusions, and the EU representative in Bolivia has done so again very recently. So it's worth noting, I think, that these harmful policies, very harmful policies towards Venezuela and Bolivia, have had particularly egregious effects during this pandemic. And in Venezuela, sanctions have made it much more difficult for the country to deal with the public health crisis and economic fallout caused by COVID-19. And in Bolivia, the de facto authorities have been using pandemic restrictions as a pretext to further persecute leaders of the mass opposition. I don't want to speculate too much regarding the UK and the EU's motivations for supporting these reckless, destructive Trump policies in Venezuela and Bolivia. There are likely economic interests mixed with the Europeans and UK's general tendency to try to placate the US on issues where there is not much resistance coming from powerful interests and constituencies. The issue is that this sort of thing will continue unless more progressives in the UK and Europe pay attention and begin to actively resist their own government's support of these policies. And hopefully those of you that are already doing that will be joined by many others. And I just wanted to finish by mentioning that you can find more information on the impact of US sanctions on Venezuela and on the OAS's false claims in the Bolivian elections on our website at www.cepr.net. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Alex. So now we'll go from DC to Bolivia with Ollie Vargas, and hopefully the connection will be all right. Ollie, over to you.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think is a great opportunity to help shine a light on what's happening in Bolivia, because most international media, of course, that after the main liberal newspapers, The Guardian, the New York Times, repeated the narratives around Evo Morales was an authoritarian leader, that you know, there'd been allegations of voter fraud, where they'd quote people like Marco Rubio. So I think that was the narrative that was going around at the time. And now what we've seen since then is a wider understanding international at the authoritarianism.
Ollie, your line is breaking up a little bit, so maybe we should go to...
Am I okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's breaking up. So why don't we go to the video that you've prepared, and then maybe you can try and connect again, because we're sadly missing what you're saying. Sorry.
Okay.
So here is a video from Ollie.
Kasachwan News is the English language service of Radio Kasachwan Coca, the official outlet of the 6 federations of the Tropico, who are the Chapari Campesino unions leading the fight against the US-backed regime.
Que sería en este momento en el país el único medio que pretende hablar desde las bases campesinas, desde las áreas rurales, y que busque dar información real.
Radio Kasachwan Coca has become the most important media outlet, providing a voice to the indigenous and worker movements throughout Bolivia. The movements have been persecuted since the November 2019 coup.
This service in English reports from the Tropic of Cochabamba and was created because the social movements demand that their struggles and the human rights abuses they face be heard on an international level. The regime must be aware that the world is watching them.
To shine a light on the situation in Bolivia is to shine a light on how the US maintains control of the global South. Bolivia's indigenous campesino movements are now fighting to save Bolivia's natural resources from colonial plunder while fighting to restore the popular indigenous democracy which has been built while demanding fair elections in order to do away with Washington's puppet regime.
La radio va a ser con esta línea permanente, línea anticapitalista, antiimperialista, extremadamente popular, altamente participativa además, que es lo que queremos, pero al mismo tiempo el hacer este tipo de medio, como es este papel en el medio de comunicación, es también muy peligroso, porque en tanto tú cuestionas a las autoridades, siempre vas a recibir amenazas, siempre vas a tener a alguien mirándote de cerca o de lejos, o de repente apuntándote con el arma de apagar tu medio o de intervenir. Eso pasó en estos días de conflicto. Cada día recibíamos llamadas de amenaza, diciendo que apaguemos la radio, diciéndonos que nos estaban mirando, nos estaban escuchando.
As Bolivia's regime desperately tries to cling to power and cancel any elections, they're looking to shut down media outlets like ours. Just a few days ago, Interior Minister Arturo Murillo said that Casachuan should be shut down for promoting so-called sedition.
Follow Casachuan News on Twitter and Facebook.
Thanks for that, Ollie. And just whilst you get back on, I just want to mention we've got over 250 people joining us from Colchester, Wrexham, Pontypridd, Letchworth, Hertfordshire, London, Brent, Bradford, Birmingham, Devon, Southport, Surrey and Madrid. So thanks so much for joining us, for not being at the pub, but being here. Back to Ollie in Bolivia, and let's see how we do this time.
Hi guys, can you hear me okay? I hope I've changed the couple of SIM cards, see if it's a bit better. So yeah, as I was saying before, when the connection wasn't so good, I think Alex talked about some of the what happened in the run-up to the coup, the faulty OES report, and the ways in which that fed into a violent destabilization of the country that ended with the coup, and in the ways in which there was repression, massacres, persecution following that. So I think it's important to remember that, but also it's important to be aware of what's going to be coming up in Bolivia, because Bolivia stands as an example of what happens when the US intervenes in Latin America, what happens when the US exports its brand of democracy to Latin America. Because Bolivia, before the coup, had its own brand of democracy. It had a popular democracy based around coalitions of social movements, being able to have access to power, sort of government together with the people, with trade unions, with indigenous groups, and that created sort of a popular, representative, democratic process. But all of that has since been done away with. The access the indigenous groups had to power has disappeared, and the old elites are now back in charge, and they'll do it. They are bringing forth all of the measures that those of us in, who would consider ourselves on the left in Bolivia have been warning about for many years. So just last week, we saw the regime force through an IMF deal. They accepted it through a supreme decree because the legislature had rejected it. And this IMF deal will require the government to privatize national industries. It will require huge cuts in public spending, just at a time when the government should be investing in reactivating the economy. We're actually going to be seeing cuts, seeing paralyzed development projects. And this is, a year ago when we were warning that a coup could take place in Bolivia and why that would be so detrimental. We were talking about just issues such as these, such as the return of the IMF, the return of the neoliberal model, that meant that Bolivia was the poorest country in Latin America before Evo Morales came to power. But after rejecting that model, Bolivia became the fastest growing economy. Unfortunately, all of that progress has now been destroyed. However, that's not to say that there's no hope, that it's a hopeless situation. I think September elections have been set for the 6th of September, and that's a victory, I think, for the social movements that have been protesting for a number of months for the return of democracy, for the return of free and fair elections. However, I think it's incredibly important that people around the world keep an eye on Bolivia, because we know that the regime doesn't want to go to these elections. We know that the regime is polling in third place, the self-declared president, Janine Áñez. We know that by September, the economy is going to be completely destroyed following this IMF deal. We know that by September, popular discontent will be at a level that's no longer manageable. So we know that they're not going to want to go into elections, into free and fair elections in these conditions. So they're either going to be wanting to cancel the elections, or they're going to want to commit some sort of voter fraud, rig the election on the date, a real fraud this time. And so I think international solidarity is incredibly important for that, because if the regime thinks that no one is watching Bolivia, that no one cares about Bolivia, then they'll feel they have a much freer hand to intensify the persecution that's already taken place. They feel they have a freer hand to rig the elections in a much more open way. So I think it'd be incredibly important to build ties of international solidarity with the left and workers' movements in Europe, in the UK, in the US. Build those links with the social movements here on the ground. In social movements like the Chapare Campesino unions, where I'm currently in the Tropico of Cochabamba. This is where Evo Morales was once a union leader in this region of the country of the coca growers. And it's in this region where the social movements are sort of reorganizing, recalibrating to be able to face the struggles that are coming. So I think building solidarity is incredibly important. Possibly even, I think we should be looking at organizing delegations to monitor the elections. I think the presence of international observers will not only build links of solidarity with the unions, in that those observers could come, meet with the social movements, discuss what's happening, and then go out and observe the elections. I think that could be incredibly important. I think it's also important for people to share, to continue talking about what's going on in Bolivia, because Bolivia is, as I said earlier, is an example of what happens when the US intervenes in Latin America, is an example of what regime change means. And what has it meant? It's meant discrimination and racism on a mass scale unseen for many years. It's meant privatizations, public spending cuts. It's meant economic crisis. It's meant persecution, authoritarianism. This is what happens when the US imposes its will on this region. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Ollie. And just to remind people, you can join and follow Friends of Bolivia on Facebook and Twitter and sign the document that's been posted in the chat. So now we'll go from Bolivia to Brazil with Julia Felmanas from the Brazilian Workers' Party. Thank you, Julia.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I just want to say that I am a member of the Workers' Party in London, and so I'm not really a representative for the party as such. Talking about the actual situation in Brazil and Trump, I would like to say, first of all, that Brazil, of course, is a much bigger country than a lot of the countries in Latin America. But that doesn't mean that we are safe from American intervention. Just quickly on Trump, because I'm not going to go on to talk about Trump. In terms of influences of Trump in our election, we had pretty much the same sort of things that happen in the US. We had Steve Bannon helping Jair Bolsonaro get elected here. And Jair Bolsonaro is, of course, perhaps one of Trump's greatest allies. Whatever Trump does, he tends to imitate and follow. So having Bolsonaro in government is not very good for the rest of Latin America. But I would like to go on to talk about American intervention in Brazil. And this week, we've had leaks coming out about the so-called car wash investigations that convicted President Lula in Brazil. And these leaks have shown that the FBI has been very much involved in the car wash investigation. It's true that we've always known that there's been American intervention in the car wash investigations. Back in July 2017, in a public event, the then acting Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, Kenneth Blanco, affirmed the collaboration between Brazil, the car wash investigation, and his Department of Justice. He said at the time that it is hard to imagine a better cooperative relationship in the recent history than the one between the USA and Brazil. And he went on to say that there was direct communication between American prosecutors and Brazilian prosecutors, saying that there was no need to rely on the treaties that existed between countries, that communication could take place in informal ways that could later on be formalized, and that it was due to this collaboration that prosecutors in Brazil secured a charge against President Lula. Back in 2013, WikiLeaks revealed that the USA's National Security Agency spied former President Dilma Rousseff and the Brazilian state oil company Petrobras. The Guardian at the time highlighted the importance of targeting companies in strategic industries such as the oil industry. So what was new about the leaks revealed this week? First of all, it was the scale of the cooperation, and it showed us partially how this cooperation worked. Leaks showed that the FBI was involved in the car wash investigation since 2014. It showed that the FBI had a number of agents on the ground in Brazil who had direct contact with car wash prosecutors. And it showed that the car wash head of prosecutors preferred, it was leaked through a conversation on a chat platform, that the car wash head of investigations actually preferred to have his contact illegally through FBI than formally recognizing a collaboration through the American embassy, even when some of his other colleagues stated that that may be an illegal thing to do. Leslie Bakshi, who's head of the FBI's International Corruption Unit, said that there was no point just having one single agent on the ground, that you need to have resources full-time dedicated to the cause. And by 2017, there was a 300% increase in the FBI's resources to fight international corruption. She also stated that the FBI had total knowledge of the car wash investigations. In an article that was written on the Washington Post in March 2016, she stated the objectives of the FBI's International Cooperation Unit, one of them being to protect the rule of law, which is very strange considering that the car wash operation actually broke many times the rule of law, and I'll mention this a little bit later on. She also said that the other aim of her agency was to identify violations of the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is okay as an American, for an American agency, but why should it be to the Brazilian prosecutors' interest to help the American destroy Brazilian companies as the car wash operations did? She also said that one of the things that they did do was to outreach to companies to ensure that there was a place where business can compete. And of course, American companies can compete a lot better when other companies, like the Brazilian companies in Brazil, were destroyed or severely curtailed by the car wash investigations. I'm not saying that there was no corruption in the Brazilian companies. Of course, there was. There was corruption in the Brazilian state company too. But it's not to the Brazilian government's interest to destroy a company. You can very much do like the Americans do with their companies in the US, which is to prosecute the managers, directors of that company without destroying the companies. But this is what the Brazilian prosecutors helped to do in Brazil with American aid. Leslie Bakshi carried on in the article. She said that we have seen a lot of activity in South America. She said that these cases are very politically sensitive. We saw presidents toppled in Brazil. These are the results of cases like this. And I imagine that by cases like this, she's talking about the car wash investigation. Dilma Rousseff was impeached, and most people think that she was impeached through corruption. As it happens, she was not impeached through corruption. She was, in fact, never found to have anything that linked her name personally to corruption. And the American corruption unit also says that one of the things that they want to do is protect the rule of law. And the Lula case inside the car wash investigation is full of inconsistencies and illegalities. Apart from the fact that the rule of law is broken when prosecutors do informal exchange of information, leaving aside the Brazilian federal government and the Brazilian Foreign Office, there are inconsistencies and illegalities within the car wash operation, like, for example, the collusion between judges and prosecutors. Just reminding that the judge that put Lula in prison then became Bolsonaro's Minister of Justice. There was also illegal tapping of the defense lawyers' telephones and the manipulation of releasing and withholding of information according to the politics of the time. So American meddling in Brazilians' affair didn't lead to better governments and less corruptions. They led to Bolsonaro in power.
Wow, thanks so much, Julia. It really doesn't end. It's relentless in Brazil. We are now going to go from Brazil to hearing about Cuba. So we have Lara McNeill, who recently returned as a medical exchange student and is with as a youth rep with the Labour NEC. So thanks, Lara, for joining us.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I just came on a little bit late there, and I might have to pop off after this just before questions, because I'm having a bit of a mad day with meetings, but it's a real privilege to be speaking alongside comrades from Latin America today. I wanted to talk a little bit about why solidarity matters, what we can learn from Latin America, into especially Cuba in the moment, which is, you know, coronavirus, the global pandemic. I'm a doctor, so that has been something that's, something I've noticed in Latin America in terms of health and how different the strategy is to the UK and what we can learn. But yeah, I'll talk about Latin America more generally. But yeah, I returned from Cuba in March after spending a couple of months there at the end of medical school, working in hospital. And it was really an enlightening experience. And, you know, having shown solidarity with Cuba and Latin America in my sort of political role, actually going and seeing firsthand the kind of nature of solidarity and things over there was amazing. Just to start off, why does Latin American solidarity matter? I think obviously I'm in the Labour Party, I sit on the NEC, and too often I think foreign policy and solidarity with Latin America is seen as a second thought, maybe not as important as domestic issues. Lots of people, focus on getting a Labour government no matter what, and it's more important than talking about what are seen as maybe niche issues. And we know that is not the case. American dominance and imperialism is not a niche issue. It's fundamental in our understanding of how capitalism and imperialism shapes the injustices that we see on a regional and national level, but internationally against the working class. And it's all part of and therefore it's our duty to show solidarity with those opposing American imperialism, and also expose what America is doing. I think what is happening is America is using obviously political messages, like in Venezuela and other places, to impose sanctions, then offer help. And for the lay person, they might not understand the complexities of it. And I think it's our duty to expose what America is actually doing when America sides with fascists over socialists. And obviously in my political role in the UK, I sit on the Young Labour National Committee, and we've tried to do the same thing and show solidarity. We made Lula our honorary president, I think last year, and we wrote to him when he was in jail with the support of Jeremy Corbyn. And he sent an absolutely lovely letter back, which Tribune published, and he wrote, at 73 years of age, 50 of which I've dedicated to the fight against equality, I feel rejuvenated by my nomination to the honorary presidency of Young Labour. This honour proves above all that one is only old when he abandons the dreams of his youth, and I will never abandon mine. It also proves that injustice exists everywhere, and that the workers' struggles are the same around the world. And I just think that was amazing that we could show that solidarity, and obviously everything that's happened since, to be a part of that is just so important when comrades are facing such difficult times. And we continue to do that, and I think it's really important that we in the Labour Party continue to educate our members. We show solidarity, and young trade unionists are sent from the UK to Cuba. And we need to make sure that as many young people are seeing what's going on in Latin America firsthand, and they're able to educate their comrades and friends at work. So learning from Latin America is key, firsthand and through politics. We need to combat myths that socialist countries are in any way, backward, they're failed governments, all these things that America kind of promotes. So I just thought I'd mention a little bit as well about the kind of the way that Cuba's dealt with COVID, really, because I think that's an example of just how well they're doing against such aggression from the US, and compare that to the UK, who prides itself on being, the fifth, sixth richest country in the world with the amazing NHS. We know the UN's already said that Cuba's healthcare system is an example to all other countries in the world. Life expectancy in Cuba is 81 and 77 for women and men, and the UK is 83 and 79. So it's very close, and Cuba spends less per capita on healthcare in general, and dedicates more of its GDP than the UK's to it. So we know there's a priority for health from the Cuban government, which isn't always the same in this country, and health is seen as a way of making profit in many ways. And the way that they have responded to COVID, I think the key thing is staffing. We know that Cuba has so many doctors, and that is just so different to the UK. We almost saw like a third of the workforce going off sick, and the staffing problems in the NHS were just massively exposed at this time, and it just was not the same in Cuba. They sent doctors over the age of 60 home, and they still had lots to treat patients, and we've seen that in how they've taken quarantine seriously, and we've seen that difference in the death rates, not just between Cuba and the UK, but Cuba in terms of Latin America. And I think as well, social care in this country has been completely ignored, and Cuba has the political will to look at both an aging population and social care as a way to protect their population. with a centrally planned state-controlled economy, Cuba's government could mobilize resources quickly that we couldn't do in this country when we were busy making hospitals that never got used and couldn't even make the tests and equipment. It really just puts us to shame. And we need to be telling everyone what places like Cuba are doing under such aggression from the US to prove that, one, it doesn't have to be this way in capitalist countries, and two, America is lying about what it's doing, about governments in these countries, and also that America it's not just aggression that has no effect. You know, this is having effects on people's lives. People are dying in Latin America because of America, and it's important that we reiterate that. We see in Cuba that some drugs and testing has a direct impact from the blockade, and we know that will cost people's lives. So this isn't an issue that we can't, that we should stop talking about. We've seen that Cuba, the solidarity from Cuba is not just words, it's action as well. We saw that with the cruise ship that they took UK citizens into Cuba during the pandemic, and Matt Hancock actually had to thank Cuba in Parliament, which was quite ironic. And we've seen that they've sent doctors to China and other parts of the world, which is just, solidarity is more than just words for Cuba and the Cuban government. So yeah, it's just shown that the failure of capitalist countries to approach COVID shows the complete baselessness of this perceived superiority in the world that our leaders perpetuate and the United States perpetuates, and it shows the inherent failings of a system that puts profit before people. Solidarity and collective actions are needed more now than ever, and we see that during the coronavirus pandemic. I just also wanted to quote an article in Tribune to end on why I think the UK is important in this, in the context of America being the aggressor. This quote is, the last decade of conservative policy towards Latin America shows that no coup is too violent, no regime too oppressive, and no business venture too destructive for the British government to support. We can identify the development of a foreign policy that has contributed to the destruction of human rights, a habitable climate, and sovereignty across the continent, harking back to a colonial mentality that refuses to die in the corridors of Whitehall. The harm done by this policy is inversely proportional to the official transparency about it. So it's our duty to expose what the UK government is doing and how they are complicit in aggression in Latin America. And I think that comes from a Labour Party and a Labour movement that shows solidarity with Latin America and exposes the US for what it does. And we're going to keep doing that in Young Labour and hopefully the Labour Party more broadly. And we need grassroots members to fight for it when maybe the leadership won't be so keen. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lara. That's an inspiring update. And I'm sure folks are aware there's a campaign to get the Cuban doctors a Nobel Peace Prize nomination, so you can join that. Finally, we're going to go to Colin Bergen from Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, and then we're going to answer some of your questions, put them to the panel after Colin. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for that, Suzie. And we've listened to some inspiring speakers there. And it's great that we've linked up with Bolivia. Now you're linking up with Castleford in West Yorkshire, this country knows no bounds. I want to cover 3 or 4 themes really in relation to Venezuela. And the first thing we have to start off with, listening to the speakers and watching what's happening in Venezuela, is that it's quite clear the Trump doctrine, or the Monroe Doctrine, is certainly alive and well. And no more is that clear than in Venezuela itself. Those people who followed events of Venezuela remember that Chavez came to power in '98, and by 2010, there was a determined coup attempt which nearly overthrew him. The Americans were involved in that, followed on by a massive economic blow by shutting down the oil industry. But the Venezuelan government lived through that and continued functioning. When we look at WikiLeaks, we find that the US didn't give up at that point. In fact, it doubled down and has used its financial, political, media, and diplomatic power to try and squeeze Venezuela to death. And one of the things we've seen is the channeling of millions of dollars into the right-wing opposition groups within Venezuela to destabilize, first of all, Chavez and then Maduro. And when these attempts failed, the US gave a strong backing to the violent street violence and sabotage of 2014 and 17 in an attempt to overthrow the government in that way. And that again failed. So the government of America then moved on to really tough sanctions. And we've talked about Britain. We've also talked about the EU, and one or two of the contributors have made, hopefully some people question the liberally view that the EU is a wonderful institution. But our government cannot escape from the fact, and in fact it probably is quite proud of the fact, that it supports Guaido and has recognised him as the president. I always think we should be aware of the actual facts when we argue. And what I would like to draw your attention to is a pretty arcane piece of legislation, the Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution, which deals with what happens when there is a vacancy for presidency. And I've just made a quick note of it. And there is a vacancy under the following classifications: the death of a president, the resignation of a president, the Supreme Court removing a president, the permanent incapacity or disability of a president, the recall by a popular vote of the president, or abandonment of the country by the president. Now, all these above are reasons for a presidency being declared vacant. None of them have come to pass. And even if they did, it should have been under the rule of a vice president that the elections took place. So when you hear the bourgeois politicians in Britain and America and Europe simply saying Guaido is the elect or the real ruler of Venezuela, we need to be aware of these facts. Now, the role of Britain is really, as we've always thought, the special relationship is a puppet relationship. That's really how Britain responds. And by the way, I remember way back in 2002, and this is a cautionary note to anybody in the Labour Party, that Dennis McShane, who was a Foreign Office Minister at the time, welcomed the overthrow of Chavez. I'm pleased to say that Dennis McShane ended up in prison. I wish it had been on those grounds that it had been finished up in prison. However, moving on. We've also heard the role of the British government, and let's be absolutely clear, the decision this week of the courts in Britain, proving once again that the courts are essentially the tools of the ruling class, to rule that Guaido is effectively the president of Venezuela, illustrates yet again the kind of supportive line that the British government and its various organs have played in this particular phase. Those sanctions that Alex talked about, these are not sanctions just designed to hit 18 individuals. These sanctions are hitting ordinary people in Venezuela. And as he quite correctly said, it's estimated that something like up to 40,000 deaths may have been caused by the United States sanctions on Venezuela. And I would argue that contradicts both the Geneva and Hague International Conventions. Let's see if anything happens on that one. Very recently, just bringing ourselves up to date, we've seen what many class as a kind of Dad's Army attempted coup. The left has branded it as the Bay of Piglets on May 3rd, when these kind of hodgepodge crew of American mercenaries and Venezuelan and Colombian dissidents launched a farcical coup, some would say, against Venezuela. And we've gone into the background of this on previous kind of discussions. All I will say is that even though people may laugh at it, you just remember this. This shows the determination of the United States and its backers to overthrow the Venezuelan government and keep up the pressure on the Venezuelan people. Now, I'll just finish on one thing. I think it's tremendously humbling to listen to people like Ollie in Bolivia spelling out just what a problem the ordinary people in Bolivia face. And when I see comrades, both within the Labour Party or on the left in Britain, bemoaning how bad things are and, oh, I want to pack it in, it's got too difficult, all I would say to them is, wake up. None of us have been shot. None of us have been kidnapped. None of us have been disappeared. So it's our job if we move those international politics seamlessly into our domestic politics to fight in this country, so in order that we're in a position to defend working people, peasants, and the ordinary people in the countries of Latin America. I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Colin. That's really powerful. So we're going to go to a few questions from the audience. Thanks so much for your questions. And if I can ask the panelists, when you've finished answering, if you could also just maybe give a final remark, and because then we're going to wrap up after these questions. So if you could just make your closing remarks as well. So I'm just going to pull up some of the questions we've received. So the first question from Facebook is, the media in the UK has played a terrible role in attacking progressive movements in Latin America. How can we cut through these distortions and build solidarity with the progressive movements and governments in the region? Then we have an Arsenal fan on YouTube. Given the British government is attempting to justify its support for the Trump administration's agenda of aggression in Latin America with supposed support for democracy, how can we highlight its complicities in coups against elected governments and the repression of popular movements in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Honduras, etc.? Finally, we have a question that perhaps is good for Alex and Colin, which is, could Trump use military intervention in Venezuela? So whoever wants to jump in.
Can I come in?
Yeah, please do.
Okay then, military intervention. I don't want to step on Alex's toes, because obviously Alex is at the centre of the empire, is in the very guts of the empire in DC. The lucky fella, it's a lovely city. Yeah, Trump is so erratic. This is the point about Trump. He's so erratic that you could not possibly rule out a military intervention in Venezuela in order to kind of transform the American political scene in the run-up to the US elections. And let's not kid ourselves. When you've got people like Bolton issuing his book and critiquing Trump, Bolton is no liberal. What really Bolton's critique of Trump is Trump wasn't fascist enough and is sustained enough in his attempts to overthrow regimes that Bolton didn't like. On the Arsenal fan, never mention Arsenal to a Leeds United supporter. It's if we remember the phrase of Marx that the ruling ideas are forever the ideas of the ruling class, we face a massive, massive job of battling against the propaganda machine in this country. And it links in with the first question. The Guardian, which is basically the handbook of the liberal Labour left in Britain, has been absolutely appalling year in, year out in Latin America and various other kind of parts of the world as well. So we should have no illusions in the Guardian. However, it is a site of contestation, as is indeed the Labour Party itself. We can do no other than struggle. And when we talk about our struggle in Britain, it compares to nothing to the struggle in Venezuela, Cuba, and Bolivia. We should always remember that.
Could I come in?
Go ahead, Ollie.
Thanks. I just wanted to add on the issue of the media in the UK. I think in particular in Bolivia, the Guardian played a particularly disgraceful role. While the coup was taking place, they sent a correspondent who is currently in Brazil, a guy called Tom Phillips, and he came to Bolivia a few days and left and wrote an article essentially portraying the coup in Bolivia as a sort of clash between two extremists. That maybe there are some pretty nasty people leading this, but on the other side, all these Evo Morales supporters, they seem a bit irrational and a bit, they have their own brand of extremism and populism. So, hopefully this can all quieten down and, ordinary, good old centrist politics can rule again. That's the position of the Guardian. Their diplomatic editor, I remember at the time, actually quote tweeted Jeremy Corbyn, denouncing Jeremy Corbyn for expressing his solidarity with Bolivia. So again, repeating the lie, originally appeared in the OAS talking about electoral fraud, etc. So I think it's very disappointing that The Guardian, which should be an outlet in which different views can be aired, some progressive views, unfortunately The Guardian placed itself on the side of the Bolivian far right. They placed themselves on the side of the Trump administration, of Mike Pompeo, of Marco Rubio. So I think it's incredibly important to strengthen alternative media outlets. I think in the UK, the Morning Star plays an incredibly important role in publishing work of those around the world on issues such as Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia. I think the Morning Star has always been there, not just recently, but for many, many years, building that solidarity, informing people in the UK about what's really going on and what newspapers like The Guardian aren't talking about. Of course, in Bolivia, we, as you saw in the video at the beginning of this live, Radio Calsachen Coca, Calsachen News is our English language outlet. We're trying to, this is a union-run media outlet owned by the workers' unions here in the Tropic of Cochabamba. I think building media with that kind of model, I think it will be incredibly important, not just for building solidarity with Latin America, but also for all of the struggles that are ahead, both in the UK and around the world.
Thanks, Ollie. We'll go to Julia now.
Right. I think starting to talk about the media, I think I have to agree with Ollie that we have to look for other forms of media around and not just solely rely on our mainstream newspapers. And with everybody, I agree that The Guardian has been terrible in Latin America, has been terrible in Brazil. I find it quite incredible that a newspaper, I'm not saying that The Guardian is fantastic, but it will listen to different sides. Sometimes it will have different sorts of columnists talking about different things. And in Brazil, they listen just to the right wing, they go to right wing American commentators to find out what's happening in Brazil. They don't even talk to universities. They could be interviewing university professors, but they decide to go for the sources that right-wing newspapers would go for, which I find absolutely incredible. But it is a space of contestation. And for me personally, what it has done is that I no longer trust the media, and whenever The Guardian writes something about any other country, I never trust, because I know what they write about Brazil, and I think that's incredibly sad. With regards to democracy agenda, I don't think Trump nowadays even talks about democracy anymore, does he? I don't know. It used to be a huge agenda in Brazil, in the world, the democracy. Everything was done in the name of democracy. I think it's slightly changed now. Everything is done in the name of corruption. And I think that's a big problem with the way the world is moving. But information that comes out of Latin America in this country is particularly bad. And it's really not surprising, considering, just going back a little bit about the protests we just had on Black Lives Matter. And we saw how there is a total lack of knowledge about the world and about the role of Britain and the British Empire and the world. So it's not surprising that the sort of reporting that you get of the world outside the UK is as bad as it is.
Thanks, Julia. Over to Alex.
So yes, well, first of all, on this question of possible military intervention, I agree entirely with Colin that we have to be extremely vigilant, because Trump has already publicly said that he's interested in intervening militarily. By some accounts, it's apparently, some of the top officials in the Pentagon that have kept that from happening so far. And there's, of course, the huge temptation of, what Colin was referring to, an October surprise, as it's called, where when an incumbent is doing, badly otherwise, in terms of the economy, in terms of his standing in the polls, he's going to try to dig up some sort of foreign policy surprise that can whip up nationalism and fear in the populace to try to win over support. And this has happened in the past, and there are, real fears this time, since the situation, of course, is so terrible here. It's I think the government here has been handling the pandemic even worse than in Britain. I think that's actually pretty obvious at this point. And Trump is plummeting in the polls, and so I think there are real fears that he will try to pick a fight abroad. And I think two of the likely targets are Iran. I think actually Iran is more likely than Venezuela at this point, because you do have, of course, the neoconservatives here and others that are really pushing for an intervention in Iran, but also Venezuela. So we have to be extremely vigilant about that. And then on the question of the media, I think what we see is, and this has been going on for generations, is the State Department sort of generally sets the official narrative around, international developments worldwide. And the US media, generally follows. The New York Times certainly seems to follow this narrative, and the Washington Post. And then that tends to trickle down to a lot of the European media, and certainly we see some of that in The Guardian as well. And on these two examples that I was highlighting of US crimes in the region, we've been seeing this in terms of the Venezuela sanctions. We've seen so many reports on Venezuela of, the very dire economic situation there, the difficulties that people are having, malnutrition, et cetera, and very, very rarely are sanctions ever mentioned as, a cause of this, when it really is quite obvious at this point. When you reduce the country's income to the extent that these sanctions have done, and that is something that we've been able to see now, they are directly targeting Venezuela's vital oil revenue, and so really depleted Venezuela's national resources enormously. So it's really quite an obvious thing that these sanctions are having a terrible effect on the Venezuelan economy. And yet, the typical media narrative, again reflecting the State Department narrative, is that it's all the fault of the government of Maduro, and it's all Maduro's mistakes, and he's just making these wild claims about the U.S. Causing problems in Venezuela. And so unfortunately, that's the narrative I think we also find in the British media and elsewhere. And it's the same thing with Bolivia. Here you have the US and the OAS that set the narrative around the elections, that there was fraud, based on these claims made by the OAS, and that was simply not questioned by the media. And even though you had organizations like ours and independent analysts that came out saying, look, these claims hold no water, the media didn't dare step out of line from the official narrative, because they thought, oh, the OAS, this is the voice of authority. The State Department, this is the voice of authority. We must, remain within, that sort of spectrum. And if we do anything outside of that, then we're, sort of following some sort of radical left agenda or something, when it's really just a question of the facts. And if you study the facts, you can see that the OAS was in fact lying about what happened in Bolivia, and that's become clear. And so the response that we've had to that and others is to just keep hammering and hammering and hammering the fact-based counter-narrative to this official narrative. And eventually you see progress. And we saw it just a few weeks ago. The New York Times finally acknowledged that the analysis of the claims made by the OAS were flawed, were based on completely inaccurate analysis. It took them 8 months to do this, but we're finally beginning to see sort of the historical record be corrected. And that's, thanks to just lots of people that, including Ollie here and others that, just keep hammering that counter narrative, and it does sometimes finally get through, but it's a real struggle. And I think, it's important what we've seen in The Guardian, just to take that example, so since we've been homing in on The Guardian, is that there is some space for alternative views in the opinion pages. And I think, Ollie and others, Julia was mentioning this. In the opinion pages of The Guardian, for instance, you had a letter from dozens of economists and statisticians, where they made the argument that the OAS claims were false. And I think that sent a powerful message, and eventually that sort of message ripples into the news pages. The news editors tend to be very conservative and very concerned with not falling out of line from the official narrative. They can be influenced, but it just takes a great deal of hammering, and I think that's what we all have to do. I mean, I think everyone needs to write opinion pieces, needs to write letters to the editor, and so on, and try to hold these major media accountable, because we need to, because they have a great deal of influence, unfortunately.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to all of you who are hammering the counter narratives, both in the audience and all the panelists who are doing indispensable work. And do follow CEPA, Centre for Economic and Policy Research, and everyone else who's joined us today. Just to remind you, we have an amazing Arise event on Monday evening with Jeremy Corbyn and various progressive leaders from Brazil, David Miranda, who is a Guardian columnist, France, Ghana, and Portugal. So please join us this Monday evening at 7 o'clock. And again, thank you for joining us. Do follow the campaigns so we can keep building this anti-war internationalism and building solidarity with the progressive movements in Latin America. And do check out the Arise Festival website, which is arise-festival.com. Thanks very much, everyone, and I hope you will stay safe and healthy. And thanks for joining us from abroad.